Sometimes the past finds you when you least expect it, like an old friend showing up at your door after years of silence. For Elias Boone, that moment came on a cold morning in Harlan Woods when he saw something that stopped his heart. There, sitting beneath an old oak tree, was a dog with amber eyes he recognized from his childhood. Blue, the same white markings, the same gentle way of watching. But Blue had been dead for 30 years, buried behind his family's barn before everything fell apart. This couldn't be real. Yet when the dog turned and walked deeper into the forest, Elias followed. What he discovered would change everything he thought he knew about his family and why he'd been living alone in these mountains all these years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered cabin that Elias Boone called home sat like a forgotten prayer in the heart of Harlan Woods, its cedar shingles grey with age and worn smooth by 30 winters of mountain storms. From the front porch, where he took his morning coffee each day at precisely 6:30, you could see clear across the valley to where the Cumberland Ridge rose up like the spine of some sleeping giant. The view never changed, and that suited Elias just fine. At 65, he had the kind of face that told stories without words, deep lines carved by weather and worry, grey beard trimmed neat but not fancy, eyes the colour of winter sky that seemed to look through you rather than at you. His hands were scarred from decades of working timber, thick fingers that could still split kindling with the precision of a man half his age. Those same hands shook now as he set down his coffee cup. The amber-eyed dog's image burned into his memory like a brand. He'd built this cabin himself back in 75, when the world had become too much to bear and the mountains had called to him like a sanctuary. One room served as kitchen, living space, and bedroom all at once, with a stone fireplace that kept the worst of winter at bay. A smaller room housed his workshop, where he crafted simple furniture that he'd trade in town twice a year for supplies. The walls were bare except for a single photograph. 2 young men in work clothes standing beside a massive oak tree. A blue-eyed cattle dog sitting between them. Samuel had been 22 in that picture, Elias 19. Both boys had their father's broad shoulders and their mother's stubborn chin. Samuel's arm was draped across Elias's shoulders, both of them grinning at something their father had said behind the camera. Blue sat perfectly still, tongue lolling out, those amber eyes bright with intelligence. It was the last picture taken before Samuel shipped out to Vietnam. The letter from the army had arrived on a Tuesday in October of 1971. "We regret to inform you that your son, Staff Sergeant Samuel James Boone, was killed in action on October 15th while serving his country with distinction. There had been no body to bury," they said. An explosion had left nothing to send home except his personal effects, and a purple heart that felt cold as ice in Elias's trembling. Hence, their parents had died within a year of each other after that. Father from a heart attack that everyone knew was really from a broken spirit. Mother from the cancer that grief had fed until it consumed her from the inside out. The family farm had burned down 3 years later, an electrical fire that took everything except the memories Elias carried in his chest like shrapnel. He'd tried to stay in town after that, working at the lumber mill, living in a small apartment above the hardware store. But everywhere he looked he saw Samuel, in the diner where they used to eat breakfast on Sundays, in the pool hall where Samuel had taught him to shoot straight, in the faces of the other young men who had made it home from the war when his brother hadn't. The weight of those unspoken questions, why him and not me, why the good ones and not the rest of us, had nearly crushed him, so he'd come to the mountains, carrying nothing but basic tools, a truck full of lumber, and the photograph that now sat on his mantelpiece like a shrine. He told himself it was temporary, just until the raw edges of grief had healed enough for him to face the world again. 30 years had passed like pages torn from a calendar, and still he remained. His days followed a rhythm as predictable as the sunrise. Coffee at 6:30, checking the weather from his porch while the mist rose off the valley floor like the breath of the sleeping earth. Breakfast of eggs from his 3 chickens and bread. He baked himself in the old cast-iron Dutch oven. Morning work in the shop, crafting chair legs or tabletops with the same care his father had taught him as a boy. Lunch of whatever he'd canned from his small garden. Eaten standing at the kitchen window where he could watch the tree line for deer. Afternoons were for maintenance, splitting wood, mending fence, checking the rain catchment system that provided his water. He'd learned to be entirely self-sufficient out of necessity and stubbornness in equal measure. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles down a rutted dirt road that became impassable in winter. The closest town, Millbrook, was another 8 miles beyond that. A collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street like cattle huddled against the wind. He made the trip to town only when absolutely necessary. Twice a year to trade his furniture for supplies. Once more if the winter had been particularly hard and his stores ran low. The people there knew him as the hermit from the mountains, the man who spoke only when spoken to and never lingered for conversation. They respected his privacy the way mountain people do, understanding that some wounds require solitude to heal. Even if that healing takes decades, evenings found him on the porch again, watching the light fade from the sky while he whittled or repaired whatever needed fixing. He'd grown comfortable with silence, had learned to read the mountain's moods in the way the wind moved through the trees, in the calls of the nightbirds, in the distant howl of coyotes hunting in packs. It was a hard life, but an honest one, free from the complications and disappointments that seemed to follow human contact like shadows. Yet sometimes, in the deepest part of winter, when the snow piled higher than the windows and the only sound was his own breathing, he wondered what Samuel would think of the man his little brother had become. Would he be proud of the craftsmanship Elias had developed, the way he could coax beauty from raw wood with just his hands and simple tools? Or would he be disappointed that Elias had chosen hiding over living, survival over connection? The photograph never answered, but Elias kept asking anyway, talking to it sometimes when the silence grew too heavy. He'd tell Samuel about the weather, about the family of foxes that denned near the creek each spring, about the old black bear he'd named Methuselah, who came around every fall looking for easy pickings from the apple tree. Simple conversations that helped fill the vast emptiness Samuel's absence had carved from his heart. Blue had died the winter before Samuel shipped out, saving Elias from a young bear that had wandered too close to their fishing spot down by Miller's Creek. The dog had thrown himself between Elias and the confused, frightened animal, taking a swipe of claws across his ribs that opened him up like a feed sack. Samuel had carried Blue 2 miles back to the house, both of them crying, while Elias pressed his shirt against the wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. They'd buried Blue behind the barn, under the big walnut tree, where he used to sleep in the summer shade. Samuel had carved Blue Boone, good dog, into a piece of oak and driven it deep into the earth. For weeks afterward, Elias would catch himself looking for that familiar blue-grey form trotting along beside him. Would save scraps from dinner before remembering there was no one to feed them to. Now, 30 years later, sitting in his kitchen with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold, Elias tried to make sense of what he'd seen in the woods, the rational part of his mind, the part that had learned to accept loss and move forward, insisted it had been a trick of light, wishful thinking made manifest by too many years of isolation. Dogs didn't live 30 years. The dead stayed dead. The past was a country you could visit in memory, but never return to in flesh. But those eyes, ember as honey in sunlight, intelligent and patient and knowing. The way the animal had tilted its head when it saw him, the same questioning gesture Blue had made 1,000 times when trying to understand human speech. The white blaze down the muzzle, the way it moved with that peculiar rolling gait that had been Blue's signature since he was a pup, learning to keep up with 2 energetic boys. Elias pushed back from the table and walked to the mantelpiece, lifting the photograph with careful hands. Samuel's face looked back at him, young and full of life, arm draped across his little brother's shoulders. Blue sat between them, ears perked, mouth open in what looked remarkably like a grin. Three friends, on the edge of a future they couldn't imagine, one that would scatter them like leaves in a storm. "What would you do, Sam?" Elias whispered to the picture. "What would you tell me if you were here?" The photograph offered no answers, but something in Samuel's eyes, that steady, fearless gaze that had never wavered even as a boy, seemed to challenge him. Samuel had never backed down from a mystery, never let the impossible stop him from investigating. He'd been the one to explore every cave in the county, to follow every deer trail to its end, to ask the questions that adults preferred to leave unasked. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the trees at that particular angle that meant evening wasn't far behind. Soon the temperature would drop, and mist would begin rising from the warmer ground into the cooling air. Night sounds would replace day sounds, owls instead of hawks, the rustle of nocturnal creatures beginning their hunts. It was the time of day when the boundary between what was real and what was possible seemed thinnest, when a man might see things that daylight would dismiss as foolishness. Elias set the photograph back in its place and reached for his coat, a heavy canvas jacket that had served him well through countless mountain seasons. He pulled on his boots, worn leather that had molded to his feet like a second skin, and picked up his walking stick, a piece of hickory he'd carved and shaped until it fit his grip perfectly. If he was losing his mind, if 30 years of solitude had finally taken their toll, and his brain was showing him phantoms from his past, then he needed to know. And if he wasn't, if somehow, impossibly genuinely, there was a dog in these mountains that looked exactly like Blue, then he owed it to himself and to Samuel's memory to find out why the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks as Elias stepped off his porch and headed back toward the spot where his world had tilted on its axis that morning. Behind him, the cabin settled into the lengthening shadows, patient and solid as always, waiting for his return. The old oak where Elias had first seen the dog stood like a cathedral pillar against the darkening sky, its massive trunk scarred by decades of storms and seasons. As he approached, his walking stick tapping against the forest floor, every shadow seemed to hold the possibility of amber eyes watching from the darkness. The evening mist was beginning to rise, turning the familiar woods into something otherworldly and strange. He reached the base of the tree and stopped, his breathing heavier than the gentle slope should have warranted. His heart hammered in his chest as he searched the gathering gloom for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of a screech owl, claiming its territory for the night. Blue, the word escaped his lips before he could stop it, sounding foolish and desperate in the vast silence of the forest. "Blue boy, are you there?" For a long moment, nothing answered except the echo of his own voice bouncing off the trees. Then from somewhere deeper in the woods came the soft rustle of leaves, not random but purposeful, as if something large was moving through the underbrush with deliberate care. Elias raised his walking stick like a weapon, though what he planned to defend himself against, he couldn't say. The sound came closer, steady and unhurried, until finally a shape materialized from between two birch trees about 20 yards away. Even in the fading light, there was no mistaking the silhouette, the pointed ears, the sturdy build, the way the animal held its head with that particular mix of alertness and calm that had been Blue's trademark. The dog stepped into a shaft of late sunlight that filtered through the canopy, and Elias felt his knees buckle. It was Blue, every marking exactly as he remembered, down to the small patch of darker fur behind the left ear that looked like a thumbprint. The white blaze ran from the top of the dog's head to the tip of his black nose in a perfect line. Those amber eyes regarded Elias with the same patient intelligence that had gazed up at him from countless fishing trips and camping adventures 40 years past. "This isn't possible," Elias whispered. But even as he spoke, the dog began to move. Not toward him, but parallel to where he stood, padding silently through the trees as if asking Elias to follow. After a dozen steps, the animal stopped and looked back, head tilted in that achingly familiar questioning gesture. Elias found himself moving before his mind could form objections. His legs carried him forward on some deeper instinct than rational thought, following the dog as it led him along paths he'd never seen in 30 years of walking these mountains. The animal moved with the confidence of long familiarity, never hesitating at the numerous game trails that branched off in different directions. They climbed steadily upward, away from the valley floor where Elias's cabin sat, into territory that grew wilder with each step. The trees changed from the mixed hardwoods of the lower elevations to the darker conifers that thrived in the thin mountain air. Moss hung from branches like tattered curtains, and the ground beneath their feet became softer, cushioned by centuries of fallen needles. After what felt like hours, but could have been minutes, time seemed to move differently. In this impossible twilight procession, the dog stopped beside a jumble of boulders that looked like they'd been dropped by some careless giant. Between two of the largest stones, Elias could see the dark mouth of a cave he'd never noticed before, though he could have sworn he'd explored every inch of these mountains over the decades. The dog sat down beside the cave entrance and looked at Elias expectantly, tongue lolling out in that familiar grin. When Elias didn't immediately approach, the animal gave a soft whine, the same sound Blue used to make when he wanted attention or had something important to show the boys. Elias pulled a small flashlight from his coat pocket, one of the few concessions to modern convenience he allowed himself. The beam cut through the darkness as he approached the cave entrance, revealing smooth stone walls that suggested this wasn't a natural formation, but something carved by human hands long ago. He had to duck his head to enter. But once inside, the ceiling opened up into a space large enough for a man to stand comfortably. His flashlight beam swept across the interior, revealing something that made him stumble backward in shock. The cave was furnished, not recently abandoned but actively lived in. A sleeping bag was rolled neatly in one corner, beside a small camp stove and a stack of canned goods. Maps were spread across a flat stone that served as a table, held down by coffee cans filled with stones. And hanging from a natural ledge in the rock wall was something that made Elias's blood run cold. A worn leather collar, cracked with age but still bearing a metal tag that caught his flashlight beam. With trembling hands, Elias lifted the collar from its resting place and brought it close to the light. The leather was soft with wear, shaped by years of use around a dog's neck. The metal tag was green with oxidation, but he could still make out the letters stamped into its surface. Blue Boone. It was impossible. He'd buried this collar with Blue 35 years ago, had watched Samuel lower the dog into the ground behind their family barn. Yet here it was, as real as the stone walls around him, as solid as the ground beneath his feet. The dog, Blue. It had to be Blue, somehow, had followed him into the cave and now sat watching with those knowing eyes. As Elias stared at the collar, the animal approached and nuzzled his hand with a wet nose, the gesture so achingly familiar that tears began to blur his vision. How? Elias whispered. How is this possible? Blue offered no answers, but he moved to the stone table where the maps were spread and placed one paw on the largest chart. Elias followed, his flashlight revealing topographical maps of the entire mountain region, marked with red X's and connected by lines drawn in pencil. Some locations were circled in blue ink, others crossed out entirely. It looked like someone had been conducting a systematic search of some kind, covering ground that would take months to traverse on foot. Beside the maps lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and damp. Elias opened it carefully, afraid it might crumble in his hands, and found himself staring at handwriting he recognized as surely as his own face in a mirror. Samuel's handwriting, neat, precise letters formed by the same hand that had written letters home from basic training. Thank you notes to their mother, his name in the family Bible. The first entry was dated just over 5 years ago. Day 1 in the mountains, the entry began. Found this cave system thanks to the dog. Still can't believe he's here. Still can't understand how, but I've learned to stop questioning miracles when they show up wearing familiar faces. The others think I'm crazy, talking to a ghost dog, but Blue's been the best tracker we've had. He found this place when we needed it most. Elias flipped through more pages, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the journal steady. Entry after entry in Samuel's careful script, detailing life in hiding, mentioning the others repeatedly, describing a network of men living off the grid in these mountains. Veterans, from what Elias could piece together, men who had found it impossible to return to normal life after their wars. One entry, dated 3 months ago, stopped him cold. Blue led me to the old oak today. The one where we used to meet when we were kids playing hide and seek. He keeps going there, like he's waiting for someone. Sometimes I think he knows things the rest of us don't, sees connections across time that we can't understand. If something happens to me, if I don't make it through what's coming, maybe he'll find a way to bring Elias here. My little brother deserves to know the truth. The journal slipped from Elias's numb fingers and fell to the stone floor with a sound like thunder in the small space. Samuel was alive, had been alive for years, living in these mountains, hiding from something or someone. And Blue, somehow, impossibly, Blue had been with him, had been waiting at that oak tree for Elias to find him. Outside the cave, night had fully fallen, and the mountain darkness was complete. But inside this small stone chamber, lit by his small flashlight, Elias felt like he was standing at the center of a mystery that would reshape everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, and the nature of what was possible in this world. Blue nudged the journal with his nose, then looked up at Elias with those patient amber eyes, as if to say, "Now you're beginning to understand. But this is just the beginning." Elias spent the night in the cave, unable to tear himself away from Samuel's journal, even as his flashlight batteries grew dim. Blue curled up beside him like he had countless times during their boyhood camping trips, his warm presence the only thing keeping Elias anchored to sanity as he read entry after entry that rewrote his understanding of the last 30 years. Samuel's words painted a picture of a man haunted by more than just war. The entries spoke of shame that cut deeper than any wound, of things done in the jungles of Vietnam that no amount of time could wash clean. He wrote about nightmares that followed him across oceans and decades, about the impossibility of returning to a world that expected him to be the same boy who had left Harlan County in 1970. "The army told everyone I was dead," one entry read, dated 2 years ago. Maybe that was for the best. The Samuel who came back from that place wasn't the same one who left. He died over there, piece by piece, until all that remained was someone wearing his face. I couldn't go home and pretend to be a hero when I knew what I'd become. As dawn light began to filter through the cave entrance, Elias found the entry that made his blood run cold. Samuel wrote about a night patrol in 1971, about orders that came down from Lieutenant Bradley, orders that no decent man should have been asked to follow. A village that intelligence claimed was harboring enemy combatants. Samuel's careful handwriting described the horror that followed. The realization that the intelligence had been wrong, that they had murdered innocent people based on lies and assumptions. I was the only one who spoke up. Samuel had written, "When we got back to base, I told them what really happened. Told them about the children, about the old man who begged for mercy in broken English. Bradley said it was them or us, said war made these choices necessary. But I couldn't live with it. I filed a report. The consequences had been swift and brutal. Bradley, who came from a political family with connections reaching all the way to Washington, made it clear that Samuel's version of events would never see the light of day. Within weeks, Samuel found himself assigned to the most dangerous missions, sent on patrols that felt more like assassination attempts than military operations. "He's trying to get me killed," Samuel had written. "Make it look like an accident so his secret stays buried." The other boys in the unit, they're scared too. They know if I disappear, no one will ever question what happened in that village. But I've made copies of everything, hidden them where Bradley will never find them. The staged death had been Samuel's own idea. He crafted with the help of a medic named Rodriguez, who couldn't stomach Bradley's cover-up. An explosion during a firefight, Samuel's dog tags and personal effects sent home to a grieving family, while the real Samuel disappeared into the jungle with evidence that could destroy Bradley's career and possibly land him in military prison. "I've been dead for over 50 years, Samuel had written in a recent entry. "Sometimes I wonder if that's not the truest thing about me now. The boy who left home died in that village with those innocent people. What came back was something else entirely. But then there were other entries, ones that spoke of hope found in unexpected places. Samuel wrote about finding other veterans in these mountains, men who, like him, had discovered that the world they'd been promised didn't exist anymore, that the hero's welcome was reserved for wars with cleaner endings and clearer victories. They'd formed a loose community of the forgotten and the haunted, taking care of each other in ways the government and society had failed to do. "Old Pete found me first," Samuel had written about a man named Peterson, a Korean War veteran who'd been living off-grid since 1953. Said he'd been waiting for others like him, men who'd seen too much and couldn't pretend anymore. "There's a network of us scattered through these mountains, Appalachia's full of places where a man can disappear if he needs to." As Elias read, Blue stirred beside him, lifting his head and looking toward the cave entrance with an alertness that suggested he'd heard something the human ears couldn't detect. The dog rose silently and padded to the mouth of the cave, where he sat perfectly still, watching and listening. The journal revealed that Bradley had not been content to let sleeping dogs lie. Now Congressman Bradley, he'd built a career on his military service, carefully omitting the darker chapters while positioning himself as a champion of veterans' rights. But Samuel's evidence remained a threat, and over the years, Bradley had made several attempts to locate and silence the only witness to his war crimes. "He's got people looking for me," Samuel had written just 6 months ago. "Mercenaries, not government. Men who know how to hunt and kill without leaving questions behind. I've moved the evidence to a new location, told Blue where to find it if something happens to me. Sounds crazy, I know, but that dog understands more than any creature has a right to. If I don't make it, maybe he'll find a way to get word to Elias." The final entries spoke of a growing desperation, of hunters closing in and time running short. Samuel had made peace with his own death, but he couldn't bear the thought of Bradley continuing to profit from the blood of innocents. The last entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, contained coordinates and a simple message. "If Blue brings you this, little brother, then I'm probably gone. But the truth doesn't have to die with me." Elias looked up from the journal to find Blue watching him intently, those amber eyes holding a weight of knowledge that seemed impossible for any animal to carry. Yet here he was, exactly as Samuel had described, a creature that somehow bridged the gap between the living and the dead. "Between past and present. You've been taking care of him all these years, haven't you?" Elias whispered, reaching out to scratch behind Blue's ears. The dog leaned into his touch, and for a moment, Elias could almost feel Samuel's presence in the small cave, as if his brother's love for both of them had somehow kept Blue anchored to this world, long past his natural span. Among Samuel's possessions, Elias found something that nearly stopped his heart, a small metal case containing Samuel's dog tags, the same ones the army had supposedly sent home after his death. But these weren't the tags his family had buried in the empty coffin. These were different, bearing a different serial number, and wrapped around them was a small chain that Elias recognized. It was their father's wedding ring, the simple gold band their mother had pressed into Samuel's hand the morning he'd left for war, asking him to bring it back safe. Their father had died wearing a replacement ring, never knowing that his original had made it home after all. As full daylight streamed into the cave, Elias made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Samuel was alive, or had been until recently. There were others like him living in these mountains. Veterans society had abandoned who had found each other in their exile. And somewhere in this vast wilderness, Bradley's hunters might still be closing in on the brother Elias had mourned for half his life. Blue stood and moved toward the cave entrance, then looked back with an expression that needed no translation. Time to go. Time to find Samuel, or at least discover what had become of him. Time to honor the truth that had kept Samuel running for 50 years. Elias carefully packed the journal and the dog tags in his coat, took one last look around the cave that had sheltered his brother, and followed Blue back into the morning light. The hand-drawn map that Blue led him to next was spread across a flat boulder like an ancient treasure chart, weighted down with stones against the mountain breeze. Someone had taken great care with it, marking elevations and water sources, noting seasonal deer paths and hidden caves throughout the entire Harlan Woods region. Red X's marked what appeared to be campsites, connected by penciled lines that showed safe routes between locations, a complete network for moving unseen through hundreds of square miles of wilderness. Elias studied the map with growing amazement, recognizing his own property marked with a small cabin symbol, but seeing for the first time how it fit into a much larger picture. He'd thought he knew these mountains after 30 years of solitude, but this map revealed secret places he'd never imagined, caves large enough for multiple people, natural springs that never appeared on official surveys, hidden valleys where a man could disappear completely. Blue sat patiently while Elias traced the marked routes with his finger, occasionally whining softly when the human lingered too long at any particular spot. The dog seemed to have an agenda, a specific destination in mind, but he waited with that supernatural patience that had always been his trademark. "You want me to follow this route, don't you?" Elias asked, pointing to a penciled line that led north toward the highest peaks. Blue's tail wagged once, the same single wag that had always meant yes when they were boys. The trail the map indicated was unmarked and nearly invisible, more of a deer path that wound through stands of birch and pine toward elevations where the air grew thin and cold. As they climbed, Elias began to see signs that others had passed this way recently, broken twigs bent at shoulder height, the occasional boot print in soft earth, places where someone had paused to rest and left the faintest impression of their presence. After 3 hours of steady climbing, Blue led him to the first camp. It was so well concealed that Elias might have walked within 10 feet of it without noticing, hidden beneath a natural shelter formed by 3 massive boulders. The remains of a fire pit were carefully camouflaged with stones and dirt, but the arrangement was too neat to be natural. Searching more carefully, Elias found the signs of extended habitation, a carefully constructed lean-to built from dead branches and covered with pine boughs, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the ground was carpeted with pine needles, arranged over what felt like a foam sleeping pad. A small cache of supplies was buried beneath a pile of rocks. Canned food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and ammunition for a rifle that was nowhere to be seen. Carved into the bark of the largest boulder, almost hidden by the natural texture of the rock, were initials, J.M., Korea, 1953. Below that, in fresher cuts that looked recent, someone had added SB 2024. Samuel had been here. Recently. Blue circled the abandoned camp twice, nose to the ground, before moving to the edge of the small clearing and looking back expectantly. The trail continued upward, more difficult now, as they climbed above the tree line into country where snow might linger even in late spring. The second camp they found was more recent, and clearly abandoned in haste. A small tent was still standing, though one side had collapsed, and personal belongings were scattered as if someone had grabbed only the essentials before leaving quickly. Elias found a coffee cup still containing dried grounds, a paperback novel with yellowed pages, and a photograph tucked between two rocks. 3 men in military fatigues, young faces grinning at the camera from some long-ago war, but it was the third camp that told the real story. This one was larger, more permanent, built in a natural depression that provided shelter from wind and visibility from below. The remains of multiple shelters suggested it had housed several people at once, and the elaborate fire pit included a stone chimney that would disperse smoke and make it nearly invisible from any distance. Here, Elias found something that made his hands tremble, a piece of paper with his own name, written in Samuel's careful script, weighted down with a stone and left where anyone entering the camp would be sure to see it. Elias, if you're reading this, then Blue found you like I hoped he would. I'm sorry you had to learn the truth this way, but there wasn't time for gentler revelations. The men hunting me have found our main camp, and we had to scatter. Some of the boys are heading deeper into the back country, but I'm going after the one they call Razor. Can't let him hurt the others. Check the cache where we used to hide our fishing gear. You'll know the place. The evidence is there. Everything Bradley doesn't want the world to see. If I don't make it back, make sure it gets to someone who can use it. Our family deserves better than lies. Sam Elias read the note 3 times before the words fully sank in. Samuel wasn't just hiding anymore. He was hunting, going after someone dangerous enough to threaten an entire community of battle-hardened veterans. And he expected he might not survive the encounter. The reference to their old fishing spot sent Elias's memory racing backward 40 years, to a hidden pool in Miller's Creek, where they'd spent countless summer afternoons. They'd discovered a hollow in the bank where they could hide their gear between fishing trips, a secret cache known only to them and Blue, who used to sit guard while they dug out their hooks and line. Blue was already moving again, leading Elias down a different route than they'd taken up the mountain. This path was more direct, but also more treacherous, following ridgelines and crossing streams on fallen logs that might not hold a man's weight. The dog moved with absolute confidence, occasionally pausing to let Elias catch up, but never wavering in his direction as they descended, toward familiar territory, toward the creek where he and Samuel had learned to fish under their fathers. Patient instruction, Elias found himself remembering conversations that had seemed insignificant at the time. Samuel talking about the men he served with, how they looked out for each other, how some bonds couldn't be broken by distance or time, how a good dog never forgot the people who mattered to him, never stopped protecting them even when they couldn't protect themselves. You've been taking care of all of them, haven't you? Elias said to Blue as they picked their way down a steep slope covered in loose shale. All these lost soldiers, all these men who couldn't find their way home. Blue's ears perked forward, and his pace increased slightly. They were getting close to something important, something that would either bring Samuel back to him or confirm that his brother was truly gone this time, beyond even Blue's ability to bridge the gap between worlds. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they finally reached Miller's Creek, its familiar voice singing over stones that had known their footsteps as boys. The fishing hole looked exactly as Elias remembered it, though smaller somehow, the way childhood places always seemed to shrink when viewed through adult eyes. But the hollow in the bank was larger than it had been, carefully expanded and concealed with a covering of stones and earth that would fool casual observers. Blue sat beside it and fixed Elias with those knowing amber eyes, waiting for him to uncover whatever Samuel had left for him to find. Inside the expanded hollow at Miller's Creek, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a metal ammunition box, Elias found the faded photograph that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The image showed 2 young men in work clothes standing beside a massive oak tree, himself and Samuel at 19 and 22, with Blue sitting between them, tongue lolling out in that familiar grin. But this wasn't the copy that sat on his mantelpiece at home. This was the original. And tucked behind it were dozens of other photographs he'd never seen, pictures of their childhood that their mother must have taken without them knowing. Samuel teaching Elias to whittle on the front porch, both boys helping their father repair the barn roof, Blue chasing them through the apple orchard behind the house. Images of a family that had seemed solid and permanent, captured in moments of ordinary happiness that felt precious beyond measure now that everyone in them was gone, except Samuel wasn't gone. The evidence lay spread across the creek bank in neat stacks, organized with the same methodical care their brother had always brought to important tasks. Military documents, photographs, witness statements, and copies of reports that painted a picture of systematic cover-up reaching far beyond one lieutenant's war crimes. The original incident report that Samuel had filed in Vietnam was there, along with Bradley's response and the orders that followed. Orders designed to get Samuel killed in action before he could cause more trouble. But Samuel had been more thorough than his superiors realized. He documented everything, made copies, gathered statements from other soldiers who'd witnessed Bradley's actions. Jesus. Sam, Elias whispered as he read through testimonials from men who'd served under Bradley. Story after story of unnecessary risks taken with soldiers' lives, of orders that seemed calculated to increase casualties, of a commanding officer who treated his own men as expendable assets in his quest for promotion and glory. One statement, signed by a Sergeant Rodriguez, detailed how Bradley had deliberately sent patrols into known enemy strongholds without adequate support, then blamed the resulting deaths on enemy action. Another described Bradley forcing wounded soldiers back into combat before they'd healed, leading to permanent disabilities that could have been avoided with proper medical care. But it was Bradley's own words that provided the most damning evidence. Samuel had somehow obtained copies of letters Bradley had written to his father, a powerful senator, bragging about his aggressive tactics and his ability to make hard choices that other officers wouldn't make. In one letter, dated just weeks after the village massacre, Bradley wrote, "War requires a certain ruthlessness that weaker men can't stomach. I've eliminated the bleeding hearts from my unit and now we get results." The eliminated bleeding hearts, Elias realized, had been men like Samuel, soldiers with consciences who wouldn't stay quiet about atrocities. Some had been transferred, others had died in suspicious circumstances. But Samuel had been smart enough to document everything before his own staged death. As the afternoon light began to fade, Elias found himself studying a map that showed Bradley's rise through the political ranks after the war, from lieutenant to congressman to his current position as chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on Elias, the man who'd spent his military career destroying the lives of soldiers now positioned himself as their greatest advocate. Blue had been lying patiently beside the creek while Elias read, but now the dog's head came up sharply, ears pricked forward. Something had caught his attention, a sound or scent that human senses couldn't detect. The dog rose and moved to the edge of the small clearing, every line of his body tense with alertness. Following Blue's gaze, Elias saw nothing but the familiar forest of his childhood, the same trees where he and Samuel had played hide-and-seek, where they'd built forts and imagined themselves as explorers in uncharted territory. But something felt different now, charged with the same electric tension that preceded mountain thunderstorms. Then he heard it, the distant sound of an engine, growing louder as it climbed the rough logging road that led to this section of the creek. No one had any business up here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and hunters wouldn't be using vehicles during closed season. Elias quickly began repacking the evidence, his hands shaking as he tried to organize 50 years' worth of documents back into their protective containers. Blue moved closer, pressing against his leg in a gesture that was both comforting and warning. The dog's body language spoke of danger approaching, of the need to move quickly and quietly. The engine sound stopped somewhere above them, near where the old logging road curved around the hill. Car doors slammed, 2, maybe 3, and voices carried on the still air, too distant to make out words but close enough to send ice through Elias's veins. These weren't hunters or hikers. The voices had a professional quality, clipped and efficient, like men conducting business rather than recreation. Blue touched his nose to Elias's hand and looked meaningfully toward a dense stand of pines across the creek. There was a path there, Elias remembered now, barely visible, more of an animal trail than anything humans would normally use. But he and Samuel had known every secret way through these woods, had memorized routes that could get them home even in the dark, moving as quietly as 65-year-old joints would allow. Elias finished packing the evidence and sealed the ammunition box. The weight of it surprised him. All of Samuel's pain and hope and desperate courage contained in 10 pounds of metal and paper. As he lifted it, a loose photograph slipped out and fluttered toward the creek. Blue moved like lightning, catching the picture gently in his teeth before it could touch the water. As he handed it back to Elias, their eyes met, and in that moment, Elias understood something that defied rational explanation. This wasn't just a dog helping a human. This was Blue protecting Samuel's legacy, ensuring that their brother's 50-year sacrifice wouldn't be lost to carelessness or panic. The voices were closer now, and Elias could make out individual words, coordinates, evidence, clean sweep, professional terms used by people who did this kind of work for a living. Samuel's hunters had found the creek, and they were conducting a systematic search. With Blue leading the way, Elias waded across the creek at its shallowest point, trying not to splash, trying not to leave obvious tracks in the mud on either side. The cold mountain water soaked through his boots and made each step treacherous on the slippery stones. But Blue chose their route carefully, finding solid footing even in the uncertain light. Once across, they climbed the steep bank and disappeared into the pine forest just as flashlight beams began to probe the area around their childhood fishing spot. Behind them, harsh voices discussed search patterns and evidence collection with the casual efficiency of men who'd done this many times before. As they moved deeper into the forest, following paths that seemed to exist more in Blue's memory than in present reality, Elias carried with him not just Samuel's evidence, but also a new understanding of what his brother had become. Not just a victim hiding from his past, but a guardian protecting others like himself. A man who'd spent 50 years gathering the proof needed to bring down a system that had failed everyone it was supposed to serve. The question now was whether that evidence would survive long enough to do any good, and whether Samuel was still alive somewhere in these mountains, still fighting the war that should have ended decades ago. The carved wooden cross stood like a sentinel in the small clearing, weathered by mountain seasons, but still bearing the careful craftsmanship that marked it as Samuel's work. Elias recognized his brother's hands in every detail, the precise joints, the smooth finish, despite being carved from rough pine, the way the proportions somehow conveyed both strength and sorrow. Beneath it, a small mound of stones marked what was clearly a grave. Blue had led him here through paths that seemed to shift and change in the moonlight, moving with the confidence of long familiarity through territory that felt ancient and untouched by modern concerns. They'd walked for hours after escaping the hunters at Miller's Creek, climbing steadily into the high country where the air grew thin and the silence was broken only by the distant call of night birds. The inscription carved into the cross was simple but profound. Tommy Morrison, age 19, Vietnam 1969, he carried others when he could no longer carry himself. Below that, in smaller letters, Samuel had added, "Remembered by those he saved." This was more than just a grave marker. It was a testament to a kind of brotherhood that transcended death, a promise that no one who had served would be forgotten, even if they died alone in these remote mountains. Elias knelt beside the grave and placed his hand on the smooth wood of the cross, feeling the decades of weather that had seasoned it without weakening the message it carried. "You've been taking care of them all, haven't you, Sam?" He whispered to the mountain silence, all the lost ones, all the forgotten soldiers. From somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing came a soft whistle, 3 short notes followed by 2 long ones. Blue's head came up immediately, ears pricked forward. And he answered with a sound Elias had never heard him make before, a low whine that seemed to carry complex meaning across the darkness. The whistle came again, closer this time, and Blue moved to the edge of the clearing where he sat perfectly still, watching and waiting. After several minutes, a figure emerged from the shadows between the trees, a small woman in military fatigues, moving with the careful precision of someone accustomed to dangerous territory. She appeared to be in her 60s, with greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that missed nothing as they assessed Elias from across the clearing. A medical bag hung from her shoulder, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "You must be Elias," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that sounded like Texas or maybe New Mexico. "Samuel's little brother. He talked about you all the time. You know my brother?" Elias stood slowly, still clutching the ammunition box containing Samuel's evidence. "I'm Maria Santos, Army Medic, 1st Cavalry Division, retired." She approached the grave and placed a small bundle of mountain laurel beside the cross. "I served with Tommy here. Tried to save him when he caught shrapnel from a mortar round outside Da Nang. Didn't work then. But I've been taking care of him ever since." The casual way she spoke about caring for a dead soldier in an unmarked grave high in the Appalachian Mountains should have sounded insane. But somehow it made perfect sense in this place where Blue had been waiting 30 years for Elias to find him. "Samuel brought Tommy here about 5 years ago," Maria continued, settling onto a fallen log with the ease of someone who'd spent years living outdoors. "Found him dying alone in a VA hospital in Charleston, forgotten by everyone except a night shift nurse who barely spoke English. Samuel sat with him those last 3 days, made sure he wasn't alone at the end." She gestured toward the cross with obvious respect. "Your brother carved that marker from memory, spent 2 weeks getting every detail right. Said Tommy deserved better than a numbered grave in a government cemetery where no one would ever visit." Blue had settled beside Maria, leaning against her leg in obvious familiarity. She scratched behind his ears with practiced affection, and Elias realized that this wasn't the first time they'd met at this lonely grave site. "How long have you been up here?" Elias asked. "Full time?" "About 8 years. But I've known about the network for longer than that. There are maybe 30 of us scattered through these mountains, men and women who found that civilian life didn't fit anymore after what we'd seen." Maria's eyes reflected the starlight as she looked across the clearing. "Samuel was our unofficial leader, the one who made sure everyone had what they needed to survive." "Was?" The word hit Elias like a physical blow. He left 6 weeks ago to deal with Razor Patterson. Special Forces, multiple tours, came back with a head full of bad wiring and a talent for making other people's problems his own. Maria's voice carried the weight of someone delivering news she'd hoped never to share. "Razor's been running a protection racket, forcing some of our people to work for him, smuggling mostly, using the mountain trails to move things the government would rather not see moved." She stood and walked to the far edge of the clearing, where the ground dropped away into a valley that stretched for miles in the moonlight. "Samuel couldn't stand watching Razor hurt people who'd already given everything for their country. Said some debts could only be paid in person. Where did he go?" Elias joined her at the edge, looking down into the darkness where distant lights twinkled like fallen stars. "There's an old mining camp about 20 miles north of here, up in the high country where the roads don't go. Razor's been using it as his base of operations." Maria turned to study Elias's face in the dim light. "Samuel left instructions for me to give you a message if anything happened to him." She reached into her medical bag and pulled out a sealed envelope with Elias's name written in Samuel's careful script. Inside, he found a single sheet of paper covered in his brother's handwriting. "Little brother, if Maria is giving you this, then I've probably gone to settle accounts with Razor and it didn't go the way I hoped. Don't blame yourself for not being here sooner. Some roads a man has to walk alone. The evidence you're carrying is more important than my personal vendetta. Get it to someone who can use it. There's a journalist in Washington named Sarah Chen who's been investigating Bradley for years. She'll know what to do with it. But first, I need you to do something for me. There are 7 men still trapped in Razor's operation, good soldiers who deserve better than being forced into criminality to survive. They're at the mining camp, and if I don't make it back, they'll need someone to get them out. Blue knows the way. Trust him. He's never led us wrong. Sam, below that, Samuel had added a postscript that made Elias's hands tremble. I kept our father's ring all these years, hoping someday I could put it back on his grave where it belongs. If you find me, make sure it gets there. Some promises shouldn't be broken even by death. Maria was watching him carefully as he read. There's something else, she said quietly. Razor sent word 3 days ago that he's got Samuel prisoner. He wants to trade your brother for the evidence Samuel collected on Bradley. Says if we don't bring him everything by tomorrow night, he'll start sending pieces of Samuel down the mountain. The casual brutality of the threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Elias looked down at the ammunition box in his hands, then back at Maria's weathered face. You're not seriously considering giving Bradley's evidence to that animal, he said. No, Maria replied. I'm considering something much more dangerous. Samuel always said that family was worth any risk, any sacrifice. He spent 50 years protecting people he considered family, even when they were strangers. She gestured toward Tommy's grave. Now, it's our turn to protect him. The Purple Heart lay nestled in the hollow of an ancient oak tree, wrapped in an oilcloth that had protected it from decades of weather. But it was the letter beneath it that shattered everything Elias thought he knew about his family's history. His hands shook as he unfolded the pages, Samuel's careful handwriting blurring through tears he hadn't expected to shed. Blue had led him here in the grey hour before dawn. After Maria had explained the layout of Razor's mining camp and the impossible odds they faced trying to rescue Samuel and the 7 trapped veterans. The dog had become increasingly agitated as they'd planned their approach, finally breaking away from the group and padding off into the forest with that purposeful stride that meant he had something important to show them. The tree was one Elias recognized from their childhood, the old hollow oak, where he and Samuel had hidden treasures and secrets, where they'd carved their initials deep into the bark with their father's pocket knife. But the hiding place had been enlarged, carefully concealed, and turned into a repository for Samuel's most precious possession and his darkest secret. My dearest brother, the letter began. If you're reading this, then the truth can finally be told, and the burden I've carried for 50 years can finally be shared. I pray you'll understand why I kept this from you, why I let you believe I was dead rather than reveal what really happened in that village in Vietnam. Maria read over Elias's shoulder, her face growing increasingly grim as the story unfolded. Samuel's account of the massacre was more detailed and more horrifying than anything he'd written in his journal. But it was what came next that transformed everything they thought they understood about Bradley's cover-up and Samuel's decades of hiding. The village we destroyed wasn't harboring enemy combatants, Samuel had written. It was being used as a refugee camp by families fleeing the fighting. But that wasn't the worst of it. Among the dead were 3 American POWs who had escaped from a prison camp 2 days earlier. They'd made it almost to safety when Bradley ordered us to open fire on everything that moved. Elias felt the blood drain from his face as he read the next paragraph. One of those POWs was still alive when we reached the village. He managed to tell me his name and unit before he died in my arms. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, 1st Infantry Division, reported missing in action 6 months earlier. He had a daughter back home, he said. A little girl named Sarah who would be starting school soon. Sarah Chen, Maria whispered. The journalist Samuel mentioned in his letter to you. The one who's been investigating Bradley. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity as Elias continued reading. Samuel had tracked down the families of the murdered POWs after the war. had spent years gathering evidence not just of Bradley's war crimes, but of his systematic cover-up of American casualties. Sarah Chen wasn't just a journalist investigating corruption. She was the daughter of one of Bradley's victims, and she'd been working with Samuel for over a decade to bring down the man who'd killed her father. "I've been feeding Sarah information for years," Samuel's confession continued, "but always anonymously, always through intermediaries. She doesn't know I was there when her father died, doesn't know I held his hand while he whispered her name. How could I tell her that I failed to save him, that I was part of the unit that destroyed his only chance of coming home?" But the letter held one more revelation that changed everything about their current situation. "Bradley isn't the only one hunting me. Sarah's investigation got too close to the truth, and someone tried to kill her last month, a car bomb that killed her research assistant instead. The same people who've been tracking me are now after her, and I'm the only one who can prove what really happened in that village." Maria grabbed Elias's arm, her grip tight with urgency. "If Sarah Chen has been targeted, then this isn't just about silencing Samuel anymore. This is about eliminating everyone who knows the truth about those POWs." The final pages of Samuel's letter contained coordinates and detailed instructions for reaching a hidden cache where he'd stored copies of everything: photographs, military records, witness statements, and most damning of all, audio recordings he'd made of Bradley bragging about the village massacre to his political cronies years later. "I recorded Bradley at a fundraising dinner in 1985, Samuel had written. "He was drunk and feeling invincible, telling war stories to impress potential donors. He described the village action as necessary pragmatism, eliminating security risks before they could compromise American positions. He laughed when he mentioned the POWs, said they should have stayed hidden if they wanted to live. But the most chilling revelation was saved for last. Bradley's been using his position on the Veterans Affairs Committee to identify and eliminate anyone who might know too much about Vietnam-era cover-ups. The veterans' suicide statistics everyone talks about. A significant percentage of those deaths weren't suicides at all. They were assassinations made to look like the desperate acts of broken soldiers." Elias looked up from the letter to find Maria staring at him with a mixture of horror and understanding. "How many?" she asked quietly. "Samuel estimates over 200 deaths in the past 20 years, Elias read from the final page. "All veterans who had knowledge of war crimes or cover-ups, all ruled suicide or accidental death, all conveniently eliminating potential threats to Bradley's political career." The Purple Heart felt heavy in Elias's hands as he lifted it from its hiding place. This wasn't just Samuel's medal. It had belonged to Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, given to Samuel by Chen's dying words as a token to pass on to his daughter. Samuel had carried it for 50 years, unable to deliver it because doing so would have required explaining how he'd come to possess it. "The mining camp?" Maria said suddenly, her military training taking over as she processed the new information. "It's not just Razor's operation. It's a trap. Bradley's people have been using Razor to flush out the remaining veterans who might have knowledge of the cover-ups." The implications hit Elias like a physical blow. Samuel hadn't been captured by a rogue veteran running a smuggling operation. He'd walked into a carefully orchestrated trap designed to eliminate the last living witness to Bradley's war crimes, along with anyone who might try to rescue him. "We have to get word to Sarah Chen," Elias said. But Maria was already shaking her head. No communication in or out of these mountains without being intercepted. "Bradley's people have been monitoring every form of contact for months." She studied the coordinates Samuel had left. "But if we can reach his final cache, if we can get all the evidence to the outside world at once, they'll kill Samuel the moment they realize we're not bringing them what they want," Elias finished. Blue had been sitting patiently throughout their conversation, but now he stood and moved to the base of the hollow oak, pawing at a spot where the ground looked recently disturbed. Digging carefully, Elias uncovered a small metal box containing one final surprise, a two-way radio and a sheet of frequencies, along with a note in Samuel's handwriting. emergency frequencies for military units still loyal to the old codes of honor. If you're reading this, broadcast on frequency 147.52 at exactly 0600 hours. Tell them Ghost Dog needs extraction for 7 packages. They'll understand. Maria took the radio with hands that trembled slightly. Ghost Dog was Samuel's call sign in Vietnam. But those frequencies, they're for units that officially don't exist. Special operations groups that handle situations the regular military can't touch. You think they're still monitoring after all these years? Samuel thought they were. He said there were people in the military who knew about Bradley's activities, who'd been waiting for the right moment to act without causing a political crisis. She checked her watch. It's 0545 hours. We have 15 minutes to decide whether we trust your brother's judgment one more time. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Elias held his brother's purple heart and made a decision that would either save Samuel's life or ensure that his 50-year sacrifice had meaning. The radio crackled to life in Maria's hands, and across the mountains, invisible forces began to move in response to a Ghost's final gambit. Samuel's battle-worn rifle felt like holding a piece of history itself as Elias lifted it from the hidden cache, the same M14 that had carried his brother through the jungles of Vietnam and the mountains of Appalachia. Its wooden stock scarred by decades of hard use, but its action still smooth and precise. The weapon was clean, oiled and ready, with a scope that had been added years after the war and bore the small scratches that marked it as Samuel's careful handiwork. The radio transmission at 600 hours had been brief but effective. Maria's voice, steady and professional, had delivered Samuel's coded message to frequencies that officially didn't exist. The response had come within minutes, a calm, authoritative voice confirming receipt of the message and providing coordinates for a rendezvous point where assets would be in position by 1800 hours. Now, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the high mountain valley, Elias found himself part of something that felt both impossible and inevitable. Blue led them through terrain that seemed to exist outside normal geography, paths that appeared and disappeared like thoughts, ravines that provided perfect concealment, vantage points that offered clear views of the mining camp below while remaining invisible from the valley floor. The old copper mine had been abandoned for 60 years, but recent occupation was evident in the new structures that had been built among the ruins of the original operation. Razor Patterson had chosen his location well. The camp sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by steep ridges, with only 2 approaches that wouldn't require technical climbing skills. It was easily defensible and virtually impossible to assault without taking heavy casualties. Through Samuel's rifle scope, Elias could see the layout of the enemy position with crystal clarity. The main building was a restored mining office that now served as Razor's headquarters, surrounded by several smaller structures that had been reinforced with sandbags and steel plates. Guard towers constructed from lumber and corrugated metal provided overlapping fields of fire across the entire valley floor. 12 hostiles visible, Maria reported from her position on the opposite ridge, speaking into a throat microphone that connected her to Elias and the approaching military assets. 2 in each tower, 4 patrolling the perimeter, 2 stationed at the main entrance, 2 more I can see through the windows of the headquarters building. Elias adjusted the scope and studied the faces of the guards. These weren't the broken veterans he'd expected to find working for Razor. They were professionals, clean-shaven, well-equipped, moving with the disciplined efficiency of active military personnel. Bradley's people, almost certainly, using Razor's operation as a front for their real mission. "The prisoners are in the old mine shaft," came a new voice on the radio, one of the approaching assets, speaking with the calm precision of someone conducting a briefing. "Thermal imaging shows 8 heat signatures in the underground complex. 7 clustered together in what appears to be a holding area, 1 isolated in a separate chamber approximately 50 meters deeper into the mine." Samuel, alone in the darkness of a mountain cave, probably wounded, certainly aware that his time was running out. The thought sent a surge of protective anger through Elias that surprised him with its intensity. For 30 years, he'd mourned a brother he thought was dead. Now, having found Samuel alive, he wasn't about to lose him to the same system that had already taken so much from their family. Blue had positioned himself at a natural observation post where he could see the entire mining camp, his body perfectly still except for his eyes, which tracked every movement below with the intensity of a predator selecting targets. Occasionally, he would look back at Elias with an expression that seemed to communicate complex thoughts, patience mixed with urgency, confidence tempered by awareness of the stakes involved. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the radio crackled with updates from the approaching military assets. Overwatch team in position on Ridge Alpha, sniper team ready on Ridge Bravo, extraction helicopter standing by at Rally Point Charlie, ETA to target 15 minutes from go signal. The voice belonged to someone accustomed to command, someone who spoke with the authority of successful operations behind him. Ghost Dog's final message indicated the primary target should be taken alive if possible. Congressman Bradley wants this whole thing buried, which means he needs Samuel dead and all evidence destroyed. We have a narrow window to extract the prisoners and secure the evidence before additional hostiles arrive. Maria's voice came through the radio with a note of concern. Movement on the access road. 3 vehicles approaching from the south, moving fast. Through the rifle scope, Elias watched a convoy of black SUVs navigate the winding mountain road that led to the mining camp. The vehicles had government plates and the kind of aggressive styling that suggested they carried people accustomed to operating outside normal legal constraints. Bradley's cleanup crew, the military commander reported, right on schedule. Those vehicles contained a wet work team with orders to eliminate all witnesses and destroy the site. We need to move now. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. The military assets would create multiple diversions, drawing the guards' attention away from the mine entrance while Elias and Blue approached from the blind spot identified in Samuel's intelligence. Maria would provide sniper support, taking out the tower guards when the action started. The helicopter would extract all prisoners once the immediate area was secured. What could go wrong, Elias reflected grimly, was just about everything. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in hostile territory against professional killers who had every advantage except surprise. The only things working in their favor were Samuel's detailed intelligence and the supernatural abilities of a dog who had spent 50 years guiding lost souls through impossible situations. All units. "This is command," the radio voice announced. "Execute in 60 seconds. Overwatch and Bravo teams, you are authorized to engage on my mark. Extraction team, be ready to move fast and hard once we have control of the landing zone." Elias checked Samuel's rifle one final time, ensuring the safety was off and a round was chambered. The weight of the weapon felt familiar, despite the decades since his last military service. Muscle memory awakening from some deep place where training never entirely faded. Blue looked up at him with those knowing amber eyes, and for a moment, Elias could have sworn he saw not just intelligence, but something approaching human understanding in that gaze. This dog had spent 30 years bridging the gap between life and death, between past and present, between the family that was lost and the family that might still be saved. 30 seconds, command announced. Below them, the mining camp continued its normal routine, unaware that the mountain's silence was about to explode into violence that would either liberate 8 prisoners or create 8 more. Corpses for Bradley's cover-up, to explain. Away! The black SUVs were almost at the camp entrance now, their occupants probably reviewing final instructions for eliminating everyone present and making it look like a drug deal gone wrong or a dispute between criminal veterans that had escalated beyond control. 15 seconds. Elias positioned himself at the concealed route that would take him down to the mine entrance. The path was treacherous, involving a descent through loose shale and around exposed rock formations that would provide cover from the guards, but no protection if he lost his footing. One mistake would mean a fall that would kill him as efficiently as any bullet. 10 seconds, Maria's voice calm and professional. Targets acquired. Towers 1 and 2, clean shots available. 5 seconds. Blue rose to his feet, every muscle in his compact body coiled with the tension of impending action. He looked once more at Elias, and this time the message was unmistakable. Follow me. Trust me. I'll get you to Samuel. Execute, execute, execute. The mountain silence shattered as the battle for Samuel's life, and the truth he'd protected for 50 years, began with the sharp crack of sniper rifles and the distant roar of an approaching helicopter that would either carry them all to safety or mark the site where the Boone brothers would finally be reunited in death. The evidence box felt like carrying the weight of history itself as Elias sprinted down the treacherous slope behind Blue, the sound of gunfire erupting across the mining camp like thunder rolling through the mountain valleys. Maria's sniper shots had been perfect, both tower guards dropping, simultaneously as the military assets opened up with coordinated fire that sent the remaining hostiles scrambling for cover. Blue moved through the chaos with supernatural confidence, his low profile and dark coat making him nearly invisible as he led Elias through a maze of abandoned mining equipment toward the shaft entrance. The dog seemed to know exactly where each enemy would be looking, when to pause for cover, when to move fast across open ground. The mine entrance loomed ahead, a black mouth carved into the mountainside, reinforced with timber and steel, but obviously not maintained since the original mining operation had shut down. Two guards, who should have been protecting the entrance, lay motionless beside their overturned table, victims of the precise marksmanship that had opened the assault. "Extraction team, we have control of the primary entrance," Elias reported into his throat microphone, his voice steadier than he'd expected, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Moving into the mine complex now. The response came from command with crisp efficiency. "Roger, extraction team. Be advised, thermal shows the isolated prisoner has been moved deeper into the complex. Estimate 2 hostiles remain inside with him." Blue was already disappearing into the darkness of the mine shaft, and Elias followed with Samuel's rifle ready, his tactical flashlight cutting through the gloom to reveal wooden support beams and rusted rail tracks that spoke of decades of abandonment. The air was cold and damp, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth and the sharper scent of recent human occupation. They moved through the initial chambers quickly, finding evidence of the prisoners' confinement, sleeping bags, empty food containers, and the kind of improvised sanitation facilities that spoke of long-term captivity. But the prisoners themselves were gone, moved deeper into the mine system as the assault began. The tunnel branched in 3 directions, but Blue never hesitated, leading Elias down the central passage that sloped steadily downward into the heart of the mountain. Their footsteps echoed despite their attempts at stealth, the sound bouncing off stone walls and creating an acoustic environment where determining the source of any noise became nearly impossible. Then they heard it. Voices echoing from somewhere ahead, too distorted by the tunnel acoustics to make out words, but clearly human and clearly agitated. Blue's pace quickened, and Elias found himself half running to keep up as they navigated around fallen support beams and pools of standing water that reflected their flashlight beam like mirrors. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where the original miners had followed a rich vein of copper ore, creating a space large enough for equipment and storage. Modern camping lights illuminated the area, revealing 7 men sitting with their backs against the far wall, their hands bound but their faces showing the kind of alert tension that suggested they were ready to fight if given the opportunity. These were Samuel's veterans, men in their 60s and 70s who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of soldiers, despite their current circumstances. Their eyes tracked Elias's movement with professional assessment, taking in his weapons and equipment. evaluating whether he represented rescue or additional threat. But it was the sound from the deeper tunnel that made Elias's blood run cold. The unmistakable noise of someone being beaten, punctuated by a voice that was definitely Samuel's. Though strained with pain and exhaustion, "Where is it, old man? Bradley's getting impatient, and my orders are to start sending pieces of you down the mountain if you don't start talking." Blue was already moving toward the sound, but Elias caught up with him at the entrance to the deeper tunnel. Through the rifle scope, he could see into a natural cavern where two men in tactical gear were standing over a figure chained to a support beam. Samuel looked like he'd aged 20 years in the weeks since his capture. His face was swollen with bruises, his clothes torn and stained with blood, but his eyes still held the same defiant spark that had made him stand up to bullies in their childhood and war. Criminals in Vietnam. The evidence box in Elias's hand seemed to pulse with its own weight as he realized the impossible choice before him. Samuel was maybe 60 feet away, guarded by two armed professionals who would kill him the moment they realized rescue was imminent. The tunnel offered no cover, no way to approach without being seen, but Blue was looking up at him with those patient amber eyes, and somehow Elias understood what the dog was trying to tell him. This wasn't a choice between Samuel's life and Bradley's evidence. This was the moment when all of Samuel's careful planning, all of his 50-year sacrifice, would either succeed or fail based on one simple act of faith. Trust Blue, follow Blue. Let Blue finish what he'd started 30 years ago when he died protecting the Boone brothers. The final recording device was smaller than Elias had expected, a digital recorder no bigger than his palm, lying beside Samuel's battered form in the deepest chamber of the mine. Even through the rifle scope, he could see the red recording light blinking steadily as his brother's voice, weak but determined, continued speaking into the darkness. "This is Staff Sergeant Samuel James Boone, serial number 2478965, recording my final testimony regarding war crimes committed by Lieutenant William Bradley in Quang Ngai Province, Republic of South Vietnam, October 1971. Blue had vanished into the shadows at the tunnel entrance, moving with that supernatural silence that had always been his trademark. Elias could hear the two guards growing increasingly agitated as they listened to Samuel's confession, realizing that their prisoner was creating evidence even as they tortured him. "Shut him up," the larger guard commanded, raising his rifle butt to strike Samuel across the face. But before the blow could land, Blue materialized from the darkness like a ghost made flesh, 60 pounds of muscle and loyalty launching, himself at the guard's throat with lethal precision. The key attack was so sudden and silent that the second guard barely had time to turn before Elias's shot took him center mass. The sound of Samuel's rifle echoing through the cavern like judgment itself. The first guard went down under Blue's assault, his scream cut short as powerful jaws found their mark. "Blue! Off!" Samuel's command was weak, but still carried the authority that had trained the dog decades ago. Blue released his hold immediately, backing away from the motionless guard to sit beside Samuel's chained form. His tongue lolling out in that familiar grin, despite the blood on his muzzle, Elias rushed into the cavern, his hands shaking as he worked to free Samuel from the chains that had held him captive. Up close, his brother's injuries were even worse than they'd appeared through the scope. Broken ribs, cuts that needed stitches, bruises that spoke of systematic torture. But Samuel's eyes were alert and focused as he looked up at his little brother. "Took you long enough," Samuel whispered, managing a ghost of the grin that had gotten them both into trouble as boys. "I was starting to think Blue had gotten lost." "Never," Elias replied, finally getting the last chain loose and helping Samuel to his feet. "He's been waiting 30 years to bring me to you." The digital recorder was still running, and Samuel reached for it with trembling hands. "Got it all," he said, his voice growing stronger despite his injuries. Everything Bradley said at that fundraiser in '85, everything he told his political cronies about eliminating witnesses. All the names, all the dates, all the evidence Sarah Chen needs to bury him. From somewhere above them came the sound of helicopter rotors and the sharp crack of automatic weapons fire. The extraction was proceeding, but time was running short. Bradley's cleanup crew would be regrouping, calling for reinforcements, doing everything possible to prevent the truth from leaving these mountains. "Can you walk?" Elias asked, supporting Samuel's weight as they moved toward the tunnel entrance. "I can do whatever needs doing," Samuel replied, and despite his injuries, there was steel in his voice that reminded Elias of their father. But first, he reached into his torn shirt and pulled out a small object that caught the light from Elias's flashlight. Their father's wedding ring, still on its chain, still carrying the weight of a promise made 50 years ago. "I kept it safe," Samuel said simply. "Like I promised Mom I would." Blue had moved ahead of them into the tunnel, scouting the route back to the surface, with the same careful attention he'd shown throughout their descent. But as they reached the chamber where the 7 veterans had been held, they found it empty. The other prisoners had already been evacuated by the military assets, leaving only the abandoned camping equipment and the echo of helicopter rotors growing more distant. "Command, this is Extraction Team," Elias reported into his throat microphone. "Package 1 recovered and mobile. Need immediate dust-off at primary landing zone." The response was immediate and welcome. "Roger, Extraction Team. All other packages secure and en route to Rally Point Charlie. Helicopter inbound to your position, ETA 3 minutes. As they climbed back toward daylight, Samuel's weight growing heavier with each step, Elias felt the evidence box pressing against his side. 50 years of careful documentation that would finally bring justice for Robert Chen and all the other victims of Bradley's ambition. But more than that, it represented something that couldn't be quantified or catalogued. The love of a brother who had sacrificed everything to protect the truth and the people he considered family. Blue led them unerringly through the maze of tunnels and chambers, past the scattered equipment of their enemies, past the evidence of violence and captivity, toward the sound of rotors and the promise of sky. As they emerged from the mine entrance into the fading light of evening, Elias saw the helicopter settling onto the makeshift landing zone, its crew already preparing for immediate departure. The final recording was complete. The evidence was secure. Samuel was alive. After 50 years of hiding and 30 years of mourning, the Boone brothers were finally going home together. The new leather collar was simple but sturdy, and crafted from oak-tanned hide with brass fittings that would weather decades of mountain seasons. Elias had made it himself in the workshop behind his cabin, using skills their father had taught both brothers in what seemed like another lifetime. The brass nameplate was engraved with just 2 words, Blue Boone, no dates, because some things existed outside of time. 6 months had passed since the night helicopter had lifted them out of the mining camp and into a world where truth finally had a voice. Sarah Chen's investigation had exploded across every major news outlet within days. Bradley's recorded confessions playing on television screens across the nation, while federal marshals arrested him at his congressional office. The Purple Heart that had belonged to her father now sat in a place of honor on her desk, returned at last to the family that had never stopped looking for answers. The Veteran Support Center that now occupied the old lumber mill building in Millbrook bore Samuel's name on a simple wooden sign, Samuel J. Boone Veterans Assistance Center, though Samuel himself had protested the honor with characteristic modesty. Should just say home base, he'd argued. That's what it really is, a place where people can find their way back. Elias watched from the porch of his expanded cabin as Samuel worked with a young Marine named Rodriguez, teaching him to tie flies for the trout that ran thick in Miller's Creek during spring spawning season. The kid had come back from Afghanistan with wounds that didn't show on medical charts, the kind of invisible damage that could destroy a life if left untreated. But Samuel had a gift for reaching men like that, for showing them that survival was just the first step toward living. Patience, Samuel was saying, his hands steady despite the permanent damage from his captivity. The fish don't care how fancy your fly looks. They care whether you respect the water enough to take your time, Blue lay in the shade between them, his muzzle grey now, but his eyes still alert, still watching over the people he'd chosen to protect. The veterinarian in town had declared him a medical miracle, a dog that should have died of old age years ago, but somehow maintained the vigor of an animal half his age. Elias had stopped trying to explain it. Some miracles didn't need explanations, just acceptance. The sound of a vehicle approaching made Blue's ears perk up, and soon Maria's pickup truck came into view, raising dust from the improved road that now connected the cabin to the main highway. The isolation that had once defined this place was gone, replaced by the steady stream of visitors who came seeking the peace that Samuel had found in these mountains. Maria climbed out of the truck with the easy movement of someone who'd found her purpose in life. The medical clinic she ran in conjunction with the Veterans Center had become a model for rural health care, combining traditional medicine with the kind of emotional support that came from understanding what combat did to the human spirit. "Any word from Washington?" Samuel asked as she approached, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "The congressional hearing starts next week," Maria reported, settling into the third rocking chair that Elias had added to the porch. "Sarah says they have enough evidence to keep Bradley in federal prison for the rest of his natural life, assuming he lives that long. Apparently, some of his former associates aren't happy about the attention his trial is bringing to their activities." The justice system had moved with unusual speed once the evidence became public. Bradley's network of mercenaries and political allies had collapsed like a house of cards, each arrest leading to new revelations about the scope of the cover-up. Over 200 veteran deaths were being reinvestigated, and several other high-ranking officials faced charges ranging from conspiracy to murder. "The families are getting closure," Maria continued. "Sarah's been working with victim advocates to make sure everyone who lost someone to Bradley's operations gets the full truth. It won't bring back the dead, but it means they didn't die for nothing." As the afternoon light began to slant through the trees, Rodriguez packed up his fishing gear with the careful precision Samuel had taught him. The young Marine's hands were steady now, his eyes clearer than they'd been when he'd first arrived at the center 3 months ago. He'd found work at a logging operation down in the valley, had started talking about maybe taking some college courses, about building a future that extended beyond just surviving each day. "Same time next week?" Rodriguez asked, and Samuel nodded. "Weather permitting. Blue likes to check the fishing spots early. Make sure the trout are still cooperating with our plans." After Rodriguez left, the 3 old friends sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and purple. This had become their evening ritual, a time for reflection, for processing the events that had brought them together, for planning whatever came next. "You ever think about that night?" Maria asked quietly. "About what might have happened if Blue hadn't found you?" Elias reached down to scratch behind Blue's ears, feeling the solid warmth that anchored him to this moment, this place, this second chance at family. "I think Blue knew exactly what needed to happen," he said. "Just like he always has." Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something approaching the boy Elias remembered from their childhood. "Some debts take a lifetime to pay," he said, "but some promises are worth keeping no matter how long it takes." As full darkness settled over Harlan Woods, Blue rose from his spot on the porch and padded over to his favorite sleeping place beneath the old oak tree, where everything had started. But tonight, he wasn't alone. A young German shepherd from the Veterans Center followed him, settling down beside the older dog with the easy trust of youth, learning from experience. Blue's legacy was continuing, Elias realized, not just in the supernatural bond that had kept him present for so many years, but in the practical work of healing that went on every day at the center. Men and women who'd given everything for their country were finding their way back to lives worth living, guided by the patient wisdom of those who'd walked that path before them. The circle was complete, but it wasn't ending. It was expanding, growing stronger, reaching out to touch other lives that needed the kind of hope that only came from knowing someone cared enough to wait. Whether that waiting took months, years or even decades, some promises. Elias thought as he watched Blue settle into comfortable sleep, were indeed worth keeping forever.